The three key economic issues of 2020 here in the United States. The first one, the so-called great economy. Mr. Trump says the economy is great. He says it almost every day. The Republican Party echoes him, as they do virtually everything he says, also every day. That might not be much of a surprise. He is the incumbent. He needs the economy to be thought of as great because he's running on that. He hopes to be reelected. What is disheartening for folks like me is to see how many Democrats say that too, feel they have to also kind of go along, and how many of the major media feel also that they have to go along with some statement that the American economy is in great shape and so forth. So let me tell you a story and then illustrate it. Having gone to these elite universities, I have friends from graduate school and from my life as a professor that include people on the right and people in the middle, as well as people on the left like me. And periodically we get together and we have a cup of coffee or a drink somewhere and we talk about our different perspectives. We don't agree on how the United States got into its current situation, and we don't agree on how you ought to get out of it. But we are all kind of struck over the last 2 or 3 or 4 by now years with something we do agree on, which surprises us all. And it can be summarized in this statement. This is the worst condition of the American economy in our lifetimes. As I said, these are right-wingers, center people, and left people. So how would I explain this peculiar difference that you see? And again, there's many ways, but I'm going to just pick a few to try to get the point home to you. During 2019, something remarkable happened that you may not have noticed if you don't pay attention to these sorts of things. In the years since the crash of 2008 and 9, the United States government, led by both the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, were so frightened that the crash of 2008 and 9 would bring a general depression, kind of like the crash of 1929 brought in the 1930s, that they took extraordinary steps, which you will remember, to prevent that from happening. For example, Mr. Obama, early in his administration, got passage by Republicans and Democrats of an $800 billion stimulus program. You may remember that's an enormous government spending program, basically, of really extraordinary size. At the same time, the Federal Reserve began pumping historically unprecedented amounts of money into the economy. Not only printing it and distributing it, but dropping interest rates so that everybody who's in a borrowing mood now has virtually free money, even to the point, which we hadn't had before, of negative interest rates. Some of you have read about that in our economy and around the world, there are many trillions of dollars being lent such that you give back at the end of the loan less than you took out. That's a negative interest rate built into the loan. These are enormous stimuli. This is the equivalent of somebody so badly injured in a car wreck that they're on every kind of life support there is. You know, tubes are coming into them. Everything is being done to keep them from what otherwise would happen, which is they would die. Okay? So we did that. We did that. Boy, did we do that. Well, this had consequences. When you pump all that kind of money in, and when you stimulate the economy, when the government comes rushing in with huge amounts of money to spend, at the same time that everybody who wants to borrow borrows money and pumps that into the economy, you have an economy in which suddenly there's a kind of a, think of it this way, a wall of money spending coming at you. Now, in a private capitalist economy where we allow private enterprises to do whatever they want, every business has a moment of truth. How are we, in the shoemaker or the bread baker or the car producer, how are we going to react to all of this extra purchasing power that's now in the economy thanks to the stimulus program of the Treasury and to the money increasing program of the Federal Reserve? And every business makes a choice. You can do one of two things. Seeing all that money coming, you can order more stuff so that you can sell it to the people who have all the extra money. And that's kind of what we as economists want, because that puts people to work, that gives people jobs, making all the extra stuff that the businessman or woman is going to sell to people who have all this extra purchasing power. But of course, a business has a second option. It can choose not to get more stuff. It can choose to raise the price of what it already sells. And you know, that's a lot more attractive. You don't have to spend a lot of time calling the factory to get more stuff made. You don't have to arrange for the transportation. You don't have to arrange for the storage or putting it on the shelf. You can make just as much more profit just by raising the price of everything. And if you do that, it's called then inflation. Prices go up. That's not, by the way, and inflation, therefore, isn't a mystery or isn't complicated. It's a product of, capitalism. That's how it works. If you didn't allow private enterprises to determine prices, if prices were set as part of a rational plan, well, you wouldn't have this problem, because then you could increase the money supply and businesses wouldn't be allowed to raise prices, in which case they have really only one way to make more money: get more goods, which is what we want. By the way, do capitalists ever do what I just said? Yes. Did they ever do it in the United States? Yes. Who did it? You ready? Nixon did it. Remember Nixon? He was even more attractive than Trump. In 1971, Nixon said, "We've got a terrible inflation." We did. So what Nixon did is he said, "I'm going to pump money into the economy, but I'm not going to allow businesses to raise the price, because that way I can make sure that the money we're pumping in is used to produce more goods, hiring more people." And so what Mr. Nixon did on August 15th, 1971, he declared a wage price freeze. Go look it up. You'll do the history. Some of you here were alive way back then. Okay? And here's what Mr. Nixon, a Republican conservative, here's what he did. All prices, as of tomorrow morning, I kid you not, as of tomorrow morning, all prices are frozen. If you're a business and you raise the price, we're going to arrest you and put you in jail. So I advise you, don't do it. You know how you stop an inflation? Mr. Nixon knew. Is that a problem? Not at all. How long does it take? Overnight. So next time you hear, the risk of inflation, what? That's a political issue, that's all. There's no technical problem, there's no economic problem. And if you hear someone say that to you, talk to somebody else, because you're being hustled. The next thing is they're going to sell you a major interest in the Brooklyn Bridge. So what happened with all this money? Did we have an inflation? No. And here's why. The money, when you pump it in, goes first into the hands of banks and big corporations. They didn't want to spend that money increasing production. Why? Because nobody can buy anything in America. The inequality that has been getting worse and worse for 30 to 40 years means that the mass of people don't have money to spend. They didn't have it already in the 70s and 80s, but they were able to keep spending by, you know what, borrowing. That's what you all did. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and college loans. The four ways to plunge the American people into a debt mess they have no way to get out of. But you run out. 2008 showed us you can't keep having more debt if your underlying wage isn't going anywhere, which it wasn't. So where did all the money go? It didn't go into producing goods. It didn't go into buying goods. It went into another place where people with a lot of, there we go. It went into the stock market, where the inflation is spectacular over the last 8. No mystery, we have an inflation. It's just not where you're sitting. You You don't have to pay higher prices, that's the good news, and you don't get higher incomes, that's the bad news. Unless you happen to have stocks, in which case, whoosh, they went off the chart. And 2019 was exceptionally good that way. 27% increase in the stock market in 1 year, very nice. If you are a person who has a lot of stock, your wealth went up by 29%. I won't embarrass you by asking you to look into your own financial situation and ask whether your finances went up by 29% over last year. That's a third in 1 year, third more wealth. So who's happy in this economy? People in the stock market, right? The top 5% of people in the stock market own all the stocks that matter. I know you own 6 shares of something your grandmother left you, but we all know what that means. It's very pleasurable to look at, but it doesn't count in your finances, does it? And for most of you, that's true of your pensions as well. The stocks are owned by so a tiny number of people did really well. That tiny number are the people who own the newspapers, who own the television stations, and they're the ones who are celebrating a great economy because for them, it was. But that's not a great economy for the people. That's a great economy for a very small minority of the people. Number 2, unemployment. You've been told, because that's the only other statistic Mr. Trump has. He has the stock market and he has unemployment. After that, he runs out. By the way, to measure the health of an economy by looking at 2 indices is the equivalent of your saying you feel really bad, going to a doctor, and the doctor takes your temperature and checks out the distance between your second and third toe. Those are 2 indices, and they're interesting. But if it was a doctor, that's what he did, and he told you were healthy on that basis, you know what you would do is get another doctor, because this is an idiot. A president or a party that tells you there are 2 wonderful statistics, the unemployment rate and the stock market, and doesn't tell you about anything else, you shouldn't listen to them for 5 minutes, because that's stupid. But of course not really, it's just a way of focusing you on the only thing they have that looks good. Let's take a look at unemployment. It is lower than it has been before, but I want to remind you, because I know this is a bit of a technical thing. Unemployment is measured basically in the United States in the following way. Questions are asked. Random people are selected, and they're asked a question. Are you working? If you answer yes, I'm working, you're counted as an employed person. If you answer no, I'm not working, you are asked the second question. Are you looking for work? If you answer yes, you're considered unemployed. If you answer no, I'm not looking, you are not considered to be part of the labor force and you're not counted at all. Which means if in 1 month there are, let's say, 1 million people that say, I'm looking for a work, but the next month when they're asked, they say, I've given up. There is no work, I'm not looking anymore. The unemployment rate will collapse because they're not anymore looking. But this isn't because the economy is great, it's the opposite. It's the economy is so poor that we measure that. It's called the labor force participation rate. It's the percentage of people in working age who are either working or looking for work. And we are lower now than we were 5 years ago. So part of the unemployment improvement isn't an improvement, it's a deterioration because people have given up. Young people who decide to go to school figuring I'll get a more credential and I'll have a better shot. Poor folks that they are who think like that. Or old people who give up. Or people who decide they can do better in the illegal economy than they can in the... I'm sure there's nobody in this room who could imagine such a thing, but there are people like that, millions of them, and more each day because the illegal is a better shot for income in many cases than the legal. So this unemployment number is a mirage, and even if it were true, it's just part of the story. I'm going to give you some other statistics to look at, just to give you an idea. A recent study that I produce in the Twitters and memes that we send out from Democracy at Work. A recent study of an association here in the United States indicated that people over 65 who live alone So this is mostly women because of women living longer than men. Anyway, people in the United States over 65 living alone, 50% of them, ready, have insufficient income for minimal subsistence. 50%. Of people over 65 who are living in a couple, they're both around, the number is 23%. So roughly a quarter of our older people in couples and half of our older people living alone are economically insecure. They can't make it. And that takes into account Social Security and whatever else they have. What kind of an economy is great, that has the statistics like that? Let me give you another. Well, I gave you two already. General Motors in China, that's a very serious problem coming down. Borden, the milk, a very serious debt problem. Now I want to talk about debt. And this is a wonderful example of the craziness that capitalism is. This system which, when we're all dead, 200 years from now, people will look back on this system and say, what was wrong with the people who lived like that? It's like when some of us read, I don't know, about medieval, I'm going to pick a country, Albania, and then you read stories of good religious people beating themselves over the back. Remember, you know those stories, the flagellation with twigs to beat the sinfulness out of themselves. I don't mean to upset anyone who's still engaged in that sort of thing. We don't do that physically. We use mental mechanisms to achieve the same effect. Anyway, we wonder to ourselves, gee, whoa, what people do like that. Well, they're going to look back at us, and here's what they're going to see. Capitalism crashes in 2008 and 9, as I've already told you. And because of the anxiety that it becomes a general depression and all that that would mean, the Federal Reserve comes in and drops interest rates drastically to zero, or as I said, even sometimes to negative. Well, what does that do? Well, it's a wonderful signal to every possible person, every business, every individual, every government. You now have an opportunity you've never had before. You can get free money, money you don't have to pay any interest for. If you have a problem in your business, go borrow some free money. It's an easier way of solving it than all the other options you have to solve your problem. Every government that doesn't know, for example, all those governments that were stimulating their economy, they didn't want to tax people to get that stimulus going. That would have been self-defeating. So they borrowed the money. Why? Because the interest rate's so cheap. Of course we can do this. So everybody borrowed. Everybody borrowed to solve whatever economic problem they had. Big business, small business, medium, big government, local government, regional government, individuals, you, me, all of us. A generation of young people looking at a job market that really stinks, went to schools that they might otherwise not have gone to, and they couldn't afford it. So they borrowed the money to get the degree, to get through the school, in a desperate hope not to be left out of a declining economy that isn't great. If it were great, you wouldn't be so desperate. So everybody borrowed. You know what that means? It means that today, governments, corporations, and the people are having levels of debt we've never seen before in the modern world. No one has ever seen this. And you know what that means? It means that when there's a downturn, which capitalism has every 47 years on average, for the last 200 years, without exception. That's an average, so it varies, but downturns, now the downturn is going to have a whole new quality. It doesn't just mean company A goes out of business, because company A is up to here in debt, which means when it goes out of business, it can't pay back the loans to whoever lent it money, who is now going to be dragged down by the downturn. Even if the downturn happened over here in milk, you're a bank over there who lent to the milk company, and you're dead because they can't pay you back. We have no idea how to manage that. We've never been in that situation. An economy leveled up, or leveraged as we call it, with debt like this, is an economy that isn't great. It's an economy that's very vulnerable in a very dangerous way. I could go on, but I think the point is made. To call this economy great is a pure political ploy designed to get him reelected, which is what the assassination of that general in Iraq was too. It's the same issue. Next, why is capitalism now struggling between tariffs, trade wars, and all of that? This is a very important issue which is now going to become well known. It's been a bit below the surface for a while, but it will now emerge. Capitalism has always had this kind of problem. On the one hand, in every capitalist economy, like the United States, there are businesses that want free trade. They want the world to be open so that they can produce whatever they want to produce over here, where it's cheapest to produce it, ship it over there to store it, and then move it over there to sell it. They want freedom to move and get the best price for their inputs and the best price for their outputs. It's like General Motors that wants to produce cars in China for the Chinese market. It's Pepsi-Cola, which makes more profit from the soda pop it produces outside the United States than what it does inside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those companies want free trade. But then there are a whole other bunch of companies that don't want it. Why? Because they suffer from the ability of other countries to produce stuff more profitably and bring it here. They want, ready? Protection. That's what it's called. Protection economics. They want a barrier, a tariff. Let me give you an example. Sometime over the next 3 or 4 days, the United States and France will reach an agreement, or not, about the tariffs Mr. Trump wants to impose. By the way, for some of you, this may be an important piece of information on French cheese and French wine and French brandy and all the rest of it. Why? Well, it's part of Mr. Trump's demonstration that he's tough and not letting the French people cheat us, and all of that boring rhetoric. But here's the people who like this. Napa Valley. Because if there's a tariff of 25% on French wine, that's the price. When you go to the liquor store, the French wine section of the liquor store, those prices are going to go up because that liquor store has to pay part of the cost of this tariff. The wines from Napa don't go up there. They're not subject to the tariff. So this is a way of shifting the business from the French wine or the Italian wine or the Australian wine or wherever the tariffs are hit to the American alternative. It gets even more complicated because if you do it to the French but you don't do it to the Italians, well, then it hurts France. Its exports to America drop, but the Italians don't mind because they're exempted from it. So now we get an immense amount, ready, of political horse trading. Everybody is fighting to have a tariff or to not have a tariff. If a tariff is passed, to get an exemption from the tariff. It's an endless process of stuff. That's all this is. Don't be fooled by endless claims, tariffs will help America. That is, I'm going to use a technical term in economics, bullshit. Okay? What it is, it hurts certain capitalists if you raise a tariff. It hurts other capitalists if you lower. The ones who benefit from lowering want it lowered, and their lobbyists are busy in Washington and everywhere getting that. And the outcome depends on who's got more money to hire how many lobbyists to win. That's what the outcome is. It has nothing to do with efficiency, nothing to do with America. Nobody cares. It's irrelevant. This is a fight between two groups of capitalists. That's what it always was. But the winners and the losers will change the economic environment we live in. You can see an explosion of wine being produced in America if you block the wines from Europe, or you cannot. Or you cannot. Same thing with automobiles, because Tariffs, Mr. Trump is talking about putting tariffs on European automobiles coming here. Tariffs have already changed. Let me give you one example just so you see. In 1963, long time ago, the United States imposed a tariff on European trucks, not cars, trucks, light trucks. It's a long story. It had to do with a fight over chicken produced in the United States that they wanted to sell in Europe. The Europeans would have none of it. They wouldn't allow the chickens. They still don't allow chickens. You all know about the chickens. In the United States, chickens are washed with chlorine. Every time you eat a piece of chicken, you are eating chlorine. In America, that is thought of as very sanitary. The Europeans look upon that as barbaric. So they don't allow the chicken, right? Which is one of the reasons we have so much chicken and it's so cheap, because we can't give that crap away. Okay? In retaliation, this is the truth, I didn't make this stuff up. You couldn't, I haven't imagination. In retaliation for the Europeans on chicken, just to give you an idea of how this works, the United States put a tariff on light trucks. Suddenly, at 25%, a big one. So suddenly, the American car producers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, faced a new situation. This was delicious. They now could produce trucks which before they couldn't give away because the Europeans were producing better trucks at a lower price. Now the Europeans were screwed because even though they produced, let's say, a truck at 10% less, with a 25% tariff, they were now more expensive even though they were more efficient. Notice, efficiency counted for nothing. Only in the minds of economists is efficiency a very important matter. But in the real world, it's as important as the number of pennies that fell into your shoe on the way over here. You don't care. So what did General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler do? They said, we can make more money on the pickup truck, the light truck, than we can on cars, which means we are now going to persuade the American people that the manly thing is to have a truck. You're not a real, the women they gave up on. The women in those days didn't buy trucks, didn't buy cars. That was a man thing to do. So you went after the men and you had an image, remember in the magazine, of a very tough guy with boots and he was climbing into his truck. Americans buy an ungodly number of these absurdly useless trucks. Why? Because we love the truck. Oh, come on, don't be naive. You had to be taught that there's something, ready? It's not easy, that there's something sexy about a truck. You realize how impoverished your sexuality has to be to get you going on a truck? Think about it. We produced a culture of the truck, of the pickup truck, as a somehow, people have to have it. People have nothing, who never take anything anywhere. And what they do take could fit in the trunk of a regular sedan, but they have to have a truck. They don't feel like they're a full male without a truck. That's not a product of some peculiarity of American culture or some peculiarity of masculinity. That's a product of a tariff. That's how tariffs shape a society. We are obsessed with trucks for no other reason than that we have imposed, by the way, we've imposed that. The same General Motors who doesn't want Trump to put tariffs now because the Chinese will retaliate and block them from getting into China, don't want anyone to touch the 25% tariff on trucks that they have profited from for the last half century. The lying, the duplicity, the fakery, it's as thick as any milkshake you ever had. Okay? Don't be fooled. This issue of tariffs and trade war is a fight between two kinds of enterprises. Yes, it's also a game for politicians, because politicians know that if they start talking, like Mr. Trump, if they start talking about tariffs, They're going to get very big donations from whoever wants the tariff to go up and whoever wants it to go down. They will collect and then make their excuses. Oh, I was hoping to get it down. I really appreciate the $400 million you gave me, but I couldn't get it done because of Mitch McConnell. Make something up. But it's a good ploy for politicians to get donations for what otherwise it has nothing to do with anything to do with efficiency or anything else. It's not about national interest. It's a fight between two groups of capitalists, and they have to line us up in order to get the votes in Congress for what they want. So they appeal to the public by telling us fake stories about how we should be interested in whether the tariff is high or low. Last thing, China. Well, I think I've done that already, right? China is what the United States was. It's the up-and-coming economy. There is no way around that. You can jump up and down all you want. The rate of growth of the Chinese economy is a runaway dominant over the United States. This is the lowest rate of growth the Chinese have had in many years. It's roughly 6%. Our rate of growth this year, the United States, will be 2.5%. Do you understand? They're growing at 3 times the rate, and they have been growing at 3 times the rate for 30 years. That's why they caught up. And that's why they will surpass the United States as an economic unit within the next 10 years. And there's nothing Mr. Trump can do about it. He tried with his tariffs, didn't work. He tried with the trade war, it didn't work. He can't do it any more than he can control Iraq with his army and 17 years of occupation. He can't do, and that's very frustrating. I understand it. If I were in his shoes, I'd be very frustrated too. I might be so frustrated I would go assassinate a general someplace in order to look as though I'm doing something. But he can't. But he is a master at looking at something that will look as though. And here's what China allowed him to do. He figured he could look like he's really beating up on the Chinese. So he hit them with a bunch of tariffs. The Chinese, very smart people, hit back with a bunch of tariffs. Suddenly, the farmers in the Midwest, who produce soybeans and other crops, couldn't sell them to China, which is where they've been selling them all. The Chinese arranged to get them from Brazil and other parts of the world, and the United States farmers suddenly began to think that Mr. Trump wasn't the incarnation of Jesus Christ, but he was the incarnation of somebody from a lower origins, right? So that becomes dangerous from him. That becomes dangerous politically, which is why you will see next week the signing of a little agreement between the Chinese delegation coming here and Mr. Trump or Mr. Lighthizer, who's his trade representative. That's done for domestic political reasons, like most of this is. So Mr. Trump had to back down, but then of course he doesn't look like finally he's making a deal with and he will claim a great victory. Like he claimed today that the Iraqis stood down when they sent those missiles, the Iranians sent those missiles. He'll pretend a big victory, but the Americans are not that dumb. So what is he going to do? He found a way, and you're going to see a lot of it. He found a Chinese company. He knew it was Chinese because it had a name that looks Chinese. It's called Huawei. Some of you may know this company because it's the world leader in 5G technology and all of that. So he is beating up on Huawei. He arranged for the arrest of a woman executive in Canada. Some of you know that last year. So she's still in house arrest at Vancouver or someplace where they're keeping her, the Canadians. And he is denying them. He's trying to use everything he can to get a maximum headlines. I am whacking Huawei. He even got the poor, pathetic Boris Johnson and told him that now that Brexit is reducing Britain to, I mean, really, the pits, he's going to punish them if they cut a deal with Huawei, which the British want to do. What will he do? The Americans will not share intelligence with the British. Given our intelligence, I don't understand why this is a threat, but that's another matter. It seems that the British do, which may tell you something about them. Great economy we don't have. Defeating China is not in the playbook. So for the United States, it's like what it was for Britain with America. You're going to go to war, you're going to have a revolution, you're going to have another war to try to stop what doesn't work, or you're going to recognize you better work out some accommodation here because the alternative really isn't available. It's very important to understand this. Now to leave you with one final note, a bit of a scare. This is a desperate government that we have, if you hadn't noticed it, but it's also an economy that's in tough shape. Mr. Trump is not the origin of most of what he does. He's a symptom. He's not the problem. He's acting out under the pressures he has to try to win an election that's difficult while being impeached. That's a tough game. He's doing the best he can to distract, but the real underlying problems are an economy that is in the kind of shape we're talking about, that has postponed its reckoning with its problems by a mountain of debt that it does not know how to control, and a blindness, a self-blindness that really needs psychiatric help. We are a society, we could solve these problems, but you have to admit you have them. It's like the old AA. If you're going to work with AA, you got to begin by going in there and saying, I'm an alcoholic, I have a problem, and then we can start working on how to help you and how to get you out of that mess. But we can't help you if you pretend to yourself that you don't have this problem. This is a country led by Mr. Trump who needs to set to itself, everything's fine, with the greatest economy. It's pathetic. Just like assassinating some general is a sign of weakness, of desperation, not a sign of you tough guy. It's childish. And the results have already been very bad for the United States. But again, the pretense, it's all a tough success. That's what I want to leave you with, thinking about that as you read the headlines.